Hello students, today's agenda is we're going to have a quiz, we're going to check homework, and we're going to be factoring polynomials. The homework is going to be 10.6, and so students will be able to factor complex polynomials, and that's going to be because we're going to be taking sometimes more than one step only. Okay, so we will be able to identify by checking for some aspects or structure of the polynomial. And so let's start with this one. 2x squared plus 8x plus minus 10. Sorry about that. Minus 10. The first thing that we're going to check for is if it has a greatest common factor. And remember that is the biggest number that goes into all the numbers. And for the variable, if all the terms have a variable, then we get the one with the smallest exponent. In this case, we don't have this one, so it's only 2. We don't put x because this one doesn't have an x. And we start factoring the rest. 2x squared divided by 2, x squared. 8x divided by 2, 4x. Negative 10 divided by 2, negative 5. After we have that, we check to see if these two, remember that the ones on the outsides, on the edge of the polynomials, the first and last term, if they are perfect squares, then we don't need to do the diamond. But if they're not perfect squares, then we do the diamond. Okay, so I guess the next step is to check for perfect squares. Perfect squares. And the third step is that if they don't have perfect squares, then we go to the diamond. Okay, so first check for greatest common factor, get the greatest common factor out and factor it. Then check for perfect squares on the first and third term. And if they're not perfect squares, like in here the 5 is not a perfect square, then we go to the diamond. And so in here we put the negative 5 and positive 4. When we have a negative in here, remember that we have one positive and one negative. Okay, one positive, and the biggest one is going to be, since it's positive, the biggest one is positive, and a minus, a small one. So we say that 1 times 5 is negative 1 times positive 5 is negative 5. And then when we add them, we subtract because it's a positive and a negative. We subtract. 5 minus 1 is 4 and keep the greater sign. So those will be the factors. Don't forget to bring down your greatest common factor. And you just open your parentheses, put the x in here, and then plus 5 minus 1. And that will be the answer. Again, you can always check, even mentally. 5 times x is 5x. 5 times negative 1 is negative 1x. So 5x minus 1x, it's equals to 4x right here. Okay? That's just a quick check. Again, the first thing we want to check is the greatest common factor. In here we see that both are divisible by 4. And so 4x squared divided by 4 is x squared. I've seen some people just do 4xx divided by 4. They cancel the and then they see that it's x squared. Negative 16 divided by 4 is negative 4. I check for the difference of perfect squares. Perfect squares. Difference of perfect squares is what we learned yesterday. So I bring down the GCF, open my parentheses. Whenever I have this special product, it's 1 positive, 1 negative, and we take the square root of the first and square root of the second one. And so it's xx. Square root of 4 is 2. And that's going to be my answer. Okay, so the next step is to check for perfect squares or those special products. check for perfect squares, or difference of squares in this case. Or difference of squares, and we didn't even get to the diamond. Okay, let's do another example. In here, we check for the greatest common factor again, but we notice that for the numbers we don't have a greatest common factor. 1, 1, and negative, 1, negative 1, and negative 12 doesn't have a greatest common factor other than 1. For the variables, x to the 4th, x squared, and this one doesn't have x, so we don't have a greatest common factor, so we don't do that. Also, this is a perfect square, but this is not a perfect square, so check for perfect squares. But this one is not, so then we go to the diamond. And so we're gonna put the last one in here, negative 12. The middle term, remember that if it doesn't have a coefficient, that means that it's negative 1. So we put negative 1 in here. And since this is negative, that means that 1 is positive and 1 is negative, but this is the sign of the bigger one. And a small positive, okay? So what two numbers multiply equals negative 12, but then when we subtract, because it's 1 and 1, we subtract, it's equals to 1. We know that it's 3 times 4. This is for the bigger one, so the 4 is gonna go here, and then 3 in here. And so we open our parentheses, and we're gonna put minus 4 plus 3. One thing here, however, we have x to the 4th, it's not x squared anymore. So since that comes from here, we're gonna put x to the 2nd power. And we can check with the inside and outside. Negative 4 times x squared is negative 4x squared. X squared times 3 is 3x squared, sorry. So when we put them together, I owe 4x squared and I have 3x squared. That means that I owe 1x squared. So that checks to do the happy face, makes the nose. So that means that this is the right answer. If it didn't work, then it's possibly that you would have to put x cubed and x in here, but again, it worked, so this is perfect. Okay, so in this case, we didn't do the greatest common factor, we didn't do the perfect square, we had to go with the diamond. Okay, in here, does it have a GCF? No. Does it have perfect square, perfect square? This is a perfect square, but this is not. No. Then we go to the diamond. And so the diamond, we put the 6. Now remember that you can, if you don't like to do the diamond, you can just think of numbers that multiply equals 6. So 1 times 6, 2 times 3, and then since this is positive and this is positive, that means that both are positive. So when we add them, this will be a group. Again, you don't have to do this diamond. You can do it in your mind by trying different ones. That's okay. But if you feel comfortable with the diamond, then look for two numbers that multiplied equals 16, but when you add them equals 5, well, you know that it's 2 and 3. You open your parentheses, and it's just x plus 2 and x plus 3. If you check, this is 2x, this is 3x, and so that's your 5x, so this is correct. Okay. So it's basically just trying to identify the type of problem and knowing that there is a little bit more to this part. Greatest common factor? No, because 1, 1, 2, nothing for the numbers, x, x, but then no x in here, then nothing for the variables either. Perfect square? This is a perfect square, but 2 is not a perfect square. Then let's go to the diamond. So -2 and +1. Remember that if there is nothing, it's a 1. Since this is negative, I know that I have 1 and 1. And this is positive, so the biggest one is positive and the small negative. So 1 numbers multiply equals 2. 2 times 1. And the bigger one is positive, so 2 times 1. And when I subtract, 2 minus 1 is 1, so that's good. I open my parentheses, xx, and here we have x squared, so I don't have to worry about putting the square in here. In the other one we had a 4, and that's why it was a 2 and a 2, so that when we add them, that was 4. Okay, and I just put these factors, plus 2 minus 1. I check my answer, 2 times x is 2x. X times -1 is -x. And so 2x minus x, x. So perfect. Check. Well, I hope this helped, and you can now complete 10.6. Thank you.